Well, I think we can go ahead and get started. Good morning, everyone. My name is Isaac Ona. I am an associate professor of political science here at UNC Chapel Hill. And I would like to welcome all of you to today's MURAP conference. We had a very successful day yesterday, and my hope is that we will be able to reproduce the wonderful success we had yesterday with three excellent panelists today. I would go ahead and introduce the panelists, and then they would do their presentations, and the Q&A would be after the third panelist has completed his presentation. And I would like to begin with Dr. Marina Levina. Dr. Levina is an associate professor and director of studies at the Department of Communication and Film at the University of Memphis. Her research is based in critical cultural studies with the focus on intersectional theoretical frameworks. She is particularly interested in how mediated cultural landscape constructs bodies, subjectivities, and citizenship as a part of medical and techno-scientific discourses. She has done extensive research in cultural meanings of disease, health, and pandemics, resulting in her book entitled Pandemics and the Media. And this book was published in 2015 by Peter Lang Press. Dr. Levina's research also focuses on cultural meanings of monstrosity and how monstrosities and how they construct categories of difference and otherness. Her current research interests are in critical rhetoric of science, medicine, and technology, cultural studies of monstrosity, critical whiteness studies, and affect theory. Her most recent publications include an edited collection entitled Biocitizenship, The Politics of Bodies, Governance, and Power. And this book was published by NYU Press in 2018. She also has several journal articles with very interesting titles, including Cruelty in the Age of Trump and Whiteness and the Joys of Cruelty, which both appear in the journal Communication Studies. She also recently published a book chapter entitled Non-Human Biocitizens, Lab Animals and the Politics of Hope. And this book is entitled Biocitizenship, was published in 2018. She is currently working on a follow-up book on the pandemic, provisionally entitled How to Live Through a Pandemic, Cultural Chronicles of COVID-19. Dr. Levina is a book and media review editor of the journal Women's Studies in Communication and a co-editor of Horror and Monstrosity Studies, which is a book series from the University Press of Mississippi. I would like you all to welcome Dr. Levina. So let me go ahead and introduce Dr. William Cheng. Dr. William Cheng is the chair and associate professor of music at Dartmouth College. He is the author of Sound Play, Video Games and the Musical Imagination, which was published by Oxford University Press in 2014. He's also published Just Vibrations, The Purpose of Sounding Good, University of Michigan Press, 2016, and Loving Music Till It Hurts. And this was published in Oxford University by Oxford University Press in 2019. And he is also the co-editor of Queering the Field, Sounding Out Ethnomusicology, published by Oxford University Press in 2019, A Cultural History of Music in the Modern Age, which is published by Bloomsbury Academic, and the Music and Social Justice series from the University of Michigan Press. His writing has appeared in the Washington Post, Slate, Huffington Post, Time Magazine, Pacific Standard, and the Chronicle of Higher Education. Finally, I would like to introduce Professor Paul Kudros. Professor Kudros is an award-winning investigative reporter and author whose work has appeared in the New York Times, Time Magazine, the Chicago Reporter, the Center for Public Integrity, and other national and local publications. He is the author of A Home on the Field, How One Championship Team Inspires Hope for the Revival of Small America, which tells the story of Silas City, North Carolina, as it copes and struggles with Latino immigration through the lives of a predominantly Latino high school soccer team. His book has been selected as Common Read at 4 universities, including the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. In 2014, the television documentary series Los Jets, based on his book and produced by Jennifer Lopez, premiered on cable television, starring Professor Kudros himself. He is an associate professor in the Holtzman School of Journalism and Media at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. He is also one of the founders of UNC's Carolina Latinx Center. Professor Kudros continues to write about immigration and the Latino community and is currently working on another book about the Latino community in the American South. I would like you all to join me in giving a very rousing welcome to the 3 panelists that are going to be discussing their various research with us today. So thank you. We would proceed in the order in which I have introduced our panelists, beginning with Dr. Marina Levina, who would be talking to us about her research. Dr. Levina.
Yeah, thank you so much, Dr. Yuna, for this very generous introduction. A quick note, both the special issue on cruelty in the age of Trump and the introduction essay had the very great privilege to co-author with your own Dr. Silva, and while I can see her, I hope she's there. And anyways, so as Dr. Yuna mentioned, in 2015, I wrote a book about media, how media constructs and talks about pandemics. At that point, it was a nice little book, and I got tenure, and I considered the matter put behind me. And then March hit of this year, and I found myself sort of in the middle of watching your own research interests come to life, which should terrify you all because my research interests are really quite scary. Between monsters and pandemics, I really hope we don't have to live through this. So my talk today, I really want to take us back a little bit and talk about the way we think about pandemics and the way we construct meanings around pandemics. It is hard, and I know it's a challenge right now to think critically through the thing you're living through right now. And it's been a challenge for me as well. However, I would argue that it is really important for us, for all of us, to try to have some sort of critical distance from the things we are experiencing in order to be adequately address the various challenges of it. So I want to take us back to H1N1 pandemic, which is also known as the swine flu, which started in Mexico in the spring of 2009 and quickly spread to the United States and Canada. While the pandemic was not quite as deadly as some have feared, it did usher in something that Science magazine has called the flu naming wars. The fraught negotiations in the scientific, political, and cultural and economic arenas over the proper name for this particular pandemic answered the age-old question, what's in the name? Quite a lot, it turns out. The World Health Organization banned the word swine from the description of the influenza, renaming it Influenza A H1N1, or as it was shorthanded, H1N1. A spokesman for the Center for Disease Control, CDC, in the United States commented on the name change as a response to sensitive and cultural issues in other parts of the world, as well as issues around the name's impact on commerce in the United States. Fiona Flack, for example, who was at that time a spokesman for the World Health Organization, said that while the virus was originally called swine flu because, quote, because the largest component of this new virus was actually swine flu virus, it doesn't affect pigs as far as we know. It hasn't been found in pigs. Pigs haven't transmitted it as far as we know, end quote. However, as we all know, just because the World Health Organization says something, it doesn't mean we listen. And in the United States, the name triggered the ire of the pork industry, who feared that it would adversely affect farms and industrial pork production. Farm groups mounted a campaign to rename the virus North American influenza. The US Department of Agriculture issued a written statement and publicly urged the media to stop calling this novel pandemic virus swine flu. The Department of Agriculture symbolically slapped the news media on the hand for perpetrating the term swine flu in the reports about the new H1N1 strain of influenza. In the statement posted on the USDA website, the USDA Secretary Tom Vilsack pleaded with the media, each time the term is used, it unfairly hurts American farmers who are suffering severe economic losses during these challenging economic times. And each time the media uses the phrase swine flu, a hog farmer and their workers and their families suffer, end quote. And around the world, the unfortunate name triggered a number of really unfortunate responses. Egypt decided to kill all its pigs, about 30,000 of them, even though there were no cases of swine flu in Egypt. The move was quickly criticized by international agencies, even as the press acknowledged that H1N1 was just a convenient excuse for the Egyptian government to get rid of animals that aided Zabalin, a community of people in Cairo and other cities who made their living by collecting and repurposing the city's trash. In Israel, meanwhile, ultra-Orthodox deputy health minister declared that Israel would call the pandemic Mexico flu rather than swine flu, given that pigs are not kosher. Thailand also decided to call the disease the Mexican flu. The name obviously draws the outrage of the Mexican government, and Mexico ambassador to Israel registered an official complaint, which prompted a retraction from the Israel government, insisting that it did not plan to change the name of the disease to Mexican flu. These moments of negotiations over the naming, and indeed over the meaning of the pandemic, is nothing new to the present cultural moment. It has been happening for a while. And they illustrate 2 points, which I have argued in my research on cultural meanings of pandemics. The stories we tell about disease matter. The media is instrumental in constructing and disseminating these stories, and mediated narratives of pandemics are rooted in the global flow of meaning, policies, commerce, and populations. After all, pandemics are by definition global crises. In her influential book on the HIV/AIDS pandemic, How to Have a Theory in an Epidemic, Paula Treichler calls the meaning, definitions, and attributions produced by HIV/AIDS a semantic epidemic, or an epidemic of signification. The term signification borrows from the work of Ferdinand Saussure, a Swiss linguist, who argues that language does not merely describe the world, but rather organizes it and gives it meaning. Saussure argued that the linguistic sign is comprised by the signifier, a physical representation of a sign, and signified, a mental representation or a concept, is arbitrary. In other words, the process of attaching signifier to a signifier is not guided by any inner and discoverable properties of the sign, but rather by the linguistic community or the culture in which that articulation takes place. In a simple example, the word dog, a signifier, and man's best friend, as signified, only attached together in a specific cultural setting and under particular socioeconomic circumstances. Language is therefore a socially constructed entity subject to myriad political, social, cultural, and economic forces. In the cultural, political arenas, a struggle over meaning can therefore be seen as a struggle of signification. It's like what signifier do we attach to what signifier? It is in that arena, according to Treichler, the contestation of meanings took place during the first decades of HIV/AIDS pandemic. This was a struggle over the meaning of disease, sexuality, race, and gender. In other words, it was a struggle for signification. Representation is a signifying practice because it is often a site of contested meanings, ideological struggles, and negotiated differences. Stuart Hall has argued that much throughout his entire career. Representations of disease signify various sites of ideological struggles, be it over the images of differences or the portrayal of disease as a failure of character, to consideration over whose lives matter and whose do not. The book I wrote 5 years ago was first and foremost an engagement with the construction, management, and classification of difference in the global context of pandemic. This book addressed what it meant culturally, politically, and economically to live in an infected, diseased body, be it a national, global, or individual one. It is a preoccupation with the very principle of difference as a material and embodied entity that led me to write my book and essentially do my entire body of research. I wanted to explore exactly what it means to live, love, and govern in the time of a pandemic, in a global environment where flows of commerce, politics, and scientific knowledge are essential to distribution of resources according to previously established principles of difference and otherness. Moreover, if pandemics are an issue of global security, which they are, then mediated representations of pandemics constitute subjects in global environments as a response to global crises. We can see these struggles over signification as a cultural and mediated determination of which stories are told, which one acquires the status of authority or truth, and which ones are dismissed outright. These stories are always mediated. In the current mediascape, we understand the world predominantly through the eyes of the media, be it film, television, or the internet. Moreover, and I've argued this through my entire career, and I will argue this in the book now, I argue that those narratives that construct this meaning around disease and around difference are not necessarily just non-fictional ones, but that fictional narratives matter as well. Specifically, I argue that horror narratives and their monsters, be they vampires, zombies, or werewolves, are essential in our culture's process of determining how diseased and infected bodies get classified and managed in a time of a pandemic, as well as defining what it means to survive and perhaps thrive as a human or as a monster during a contagion. So I want to take us a little bit back to the movie Contagion, which recently has gotten a little bit of press, and talk about the ways that it illustrates some of these concepts about how the world struggles with keeping itself infection-free in the age of globalization, as well as a way of talking about how it constructs the very idea of difference. So when Contagion was released in 2011, it was subject of a lot of reviews, but it also claimed some sort of a relative veracity. So very famously, they hired CDC consultants and WHO consultants to work on the movie. A lot of medical journals wrote that that movie represents as accurate of a portrayal of what a pandemic spread would look like as a fictional narrative can possibly produce. So for example, Science magazine wrote that Contagion is a familiar terrain for Hollywood, but interesting twist here is that this time Hollywood decided to let scientists in on the script. The result is a gripping yet refreshingly accurate warning about the very real threat of zoonotic disease and the potential impact a rapidly emerging pandemic could have on a society, end quote. One of the film screenwriters, Kant Burns, said that the process of making a film about pandemic and public health and working with scientists made him acutely aware how there is a shared health of society. The securing of that shared health is what I refer here as a biosecurity of population, or what Lakoff and Kohler called the various political and technological interventions and efforts to secure health. Contagion portrays zoonotic, transmitted from animals to human virus, as a threat to shared health of the global community. The threat is a direct result of globalization, both in the origin of disease and in its mode transition. The origin of disease is attributed to where, and this is a quote from a movie, somewhere in the world, the wrong pig met up with the wrong bat. And this statement by a CDC scientist in the movie revealed to be true at the end of the film, which portrays how the clearing of a native forest near Hong Kong disrupts the bat population, causing them to fly to areas they weren't before and transmit infection. I mean, we see this more, HIV/AIDS was a zoonotic pandemic. Most of, the pandemic we're living through now was a zoonotic pandemic. A lot of times, these pandemics, the origin of these pandemics is essentially a disruption of the native habitat of other species in some way, shape, or form. So in the movie portrays bats scatter, and one of them flies to a nearby pig pen, where one of the pigs subsequently eats a banana brought in by the bat. The pig is then taken to slaughter and handled by a chef who doesn't wash their hands. The chef then shakes hands with Gwyneth Paltrow character, our patient Yumara from Minneapolis, Minnesota, who carries the disease into the Western world. During her layover in Chicago, where she has sex with an ex-boyfriend, I'm sorry, wishful thinking, Beth touches bar snacks and bartender takes her credit card. The camera lingers on these details to show how ordinary contact can easily endanger shared health. Suddenly, the scene changes back to Hong Kong and then to London, England, then to Tokyo, Japan, and finally rests in Minneapolis, Minnesota, where Beth gets home to her husband and hugs her son. In each locale, there is a clearly ill person who has been infected through an interaction with Beth and who is now endangering the health of the number of people projected on the screen. It is not arbitrary that Hong Kong is a point of origin for the film's pandemic. It was picked specifically because of its status as a global city, as well as a presupposed exoticism of the type of animals being slaughtered, as well as perceived conditions of slaughtering. We see some similar characterizations in Beth's marital infidelity, a seemingly unnecessary plot point in the global reach of the virus and in the attribution of its spread to the uncivilized practices of the East, in the tale of heroic Western scientists battling the virus despite obstruction efforts of their respective governments, and of course in the tale of Chinese militia who take an epidemiologist hostage to make sure their village receives the vaccine. These are all part of what Wall describes as imagined communities formed by disease. If we apply, here she draws on work to Benedict Anderson, who in his influential book, Imagined Communities, argued that nationness is a cultural artifact and that the nation needs to be understood as an imagined political community. It is imaginary because, quote, in the minds of each member of the nation lives the image of their communion. And it is imagined as a community because regardless of inequality and exploitation, the nation is always conceived as a deep horizontal comradeship. If we apply the concept of imagined communities to global worlds, and together with mediated narrative of contagion, they illustrate how globality and pandemics are constructed insofar as whose bodies matter, whose identities are compromised, and how a population is rendered secure. The problem of pandemic is a problem of governance and security. Media narratives of pandemics put an emphasis on any local virus, infection, or disease as a potentiality for global ruin. A common headline in local, national, or international news emphasizes the global danger of a local threat and vice versa. Everything matters. Much of media coverage of pandemics focus on how an entity in a local community can potentially bring down the globe. It was a bat and a pig near Hong Kong that almost brought down the world in contagion. And while everything and anything can be a potential catastrophe, the focus of these stories are almost always Orientalist in nature. They exoticize and pathologize the communities which are seen as outside the Western imaginary. For example, the New York Times recent story on Hasidic community in Brooklyn, which was ravaged by COVID-19, focused on the large and unusual wedding ceremonies and a threat that close-knit and therefore somehow foreign communities pose to each other. At the same time, Trump's insistence on calling COVID-19 a Chinese virus, while reprehensible and obviously racist, has also demonstrated that the stories we tell about pandemics matter in how we anticipate and respond to risk. Trump's response to pandemic, I believe, can only be fully understood within the context of administration's already established cruel and xenophobic border politics, and incapability of imagining a threat that doesn't stem from brown and black bodies. The administration was able to see a threat coming from China and Iran, but not a threat coming from Italy. These travel restrictions grounded in the politics of xenophobia and racism were no match for a truly global pandemic. Much like during the AIDS epidemic, where the insistence on pathologizing the virus and ascribing it to particular sexual orientation, the current pandemic illustrates that how we signify the virus matters to the very response, and that most often we get both of those things wrong. We are unable to switch away from seeing a virus as an ultimately foreign body. Therefore, we can only conceive it in terms of that which we find at most objectionable and foreign. In this, virus is an ultimate monster. Nina Auerbach, a long time ago, said that each age has a vampire it needs. Maybe we should reframe this in terms of every age gets a virus it deserves. If so, I would argue that we are in fact a zombie nation. I must admit that when the news of COVID-19 first hit, I wasn't taking it seriously, partially because it didn't seem so very deadly, and partially because surely I thought media exaggerates, it likes a good story. What I failed to see is the scope of the pandemic as contrasted with the nature of what it means to be a zombie. So conditioned was I to see zombies as infected dead, that I forgot about zombies as infected living. COVID-19 illustrated a variation on a pandemic where we don't all just die, but where we all become infected living. Zombies as an infected living introduces life that is always already infected. This illustrates the virus as a fully intersectional mechanism in which decisions of who lives, who dies, and who is sacrificed are made not only on vectors of race, gender, and sexuality, but also on vectors of class, disability, and age. While elder people are asked to sacrifice themselves at the altar of late capitalist economy, the disabled, chronically ill, and otherwise often invisible bodies are considered to be already dead, a term used by Eric Husden to quote, names that state where one has been killed but yet to die, or one has died but yet to be killed, end quote. In my interpretation of the term, bodies most injured by late state capitalism through chronic disease, economic inequality, and environmental injustice are asked once again to be killed in the service of community and the unsustainable economic system of late capitalism. There is a grocery store employees, warehouse workers, delivery drivers, and others invisibly dying so that we, and I use we loosely, can Netflix and chill. In the moment of crisis, we once again rely on the model that furthers the already existing inequalities. It has been said that by people much smarter than me, that this pandemic didn't break us, it exposed that we are already broken. The nation state that puts its most vulnerable population at the front line of crisis is a zombie nation. We have become an infected living a long time ago. COVID-19 simply shown us what we already are. Thank you.
Sorry about that. So I was just saying, thanking Dr. Lavina for that excellent presentation. And we will now hear from Dr. William Chang.
Yep. Hi, everyone. Thanks so much to Benita Ramsey, to Mimi Gorder, Dr. Wen, Dr. Una, and all of you for joining us today. I'm going to do something a little unconventional. Can everyone hear me, by the way? I just want to make, okay, cool. I see thumbs ups. I'd like all of us to begin simply by taking 1 minute to imagine something that you believe to be virtually unimaginable. So right now, it could be trying to imagine the end of social distancing and quarantining and the end of this pandemic. It could be if you're experiencing anxiety and or depression, imagining being happy again in an unequivocal and sustained manner. It could be if you're going through heartache, imagining being in love again and being in a relationship again. I'd like you to push the limits of your imagination and just take 1 minute to think of something that is unimaginable. And I recognize that there is a paradox in this very request, but I think it could be a productive way to start these next 10 to 15 minutes that we have together. So I'll do the same. And I'm going to stop my video for just 1 minute. And when I come back, I'll resume the presentation. Great, so I hope you've all had a chance to imagine the unimaginable. I'm going to begin by telling you three things that I felt were unimaginable when I was in your shoes, perhaps, as an undergraduate. Um, the first of three things is that it was hard for me to imagine as an undergraduate that I would one day pursue academia, go to grad school, become a professor, and now a chair, for better or worse, of a department. I frequently receive congratulations as well as condolences when I tell people that I'm chairing a department. The second thing is that even it was hard for me to imagine that even were I to become a professor and chair, that I would continue to experience great insecurity and anxiety, personal, emotional, professional, intellectual, because when I was younger, I just assumed that total confidence would accompany the sheer fact of growing up and growing into professional positions of authority and privilege. And the third thing that I found unimaginable was that I would one day be invited to speak to undergraduates on the subject of care. And that's for many reasons. One is because I had a hard time imagining I would be someone who would have value in that conversation. Another reason is that I back then did not anticipate that such conferences would take place because care ethics is a relatively new intervention in philosophy, in ethics, in music studies, in sociology, in African and African American studies. It's a new and welcome intervention, of course. And what I also couldn't imagine in terms of speaking to undergraduates is that I would ultimately decide to deviate from what I had been planning to do today, which is to read an excerpt from my 2016 book, Just Vibrations, which is about care ethics in music and in academia more broadly. And before the organizers get nervous, I'm not going to do anything bad or rash. It's simply that, and it's okay if you haven't had a chance to read an excerpt from the book. When I was told that I could include reading materials for this conference, I didn't realize mine would end up being the only one, so I felt a bit sheepish about that. But the reason that I'm not going to be reading from the excerpt that is available to you on the website is because over the last several days, as this conference approached, I realized that I wasn't actually practicing self-care when I agreed to read from the book as part of my presentation. I'm very proud of the book and I'm glad that it's out in the world, and I have given talks on and from the book in the past, but it came out 4 years ago, and I've really tried to continue to grapple with care and self-care. And I didn't realize this at the time, even a week ago when I was in touch with Dr. Wen and Mimi, but I realized that I couldn't bring myself to reread, whether in my head or out loud, the pain narrative that is detailed in that book, because I'm realizing that it would have been extremely triggering and potentially re-traumatizing for me. And even though I'm deeply familiar with my own narrative, of course, and with the contents of that book, I don't want to repeat and revocalize that kind of trauma for myself. So for the sake of self-care, you're very welcome to browse and skim it at your leisure, and I hope you find things that are useful with it. But I haven't been sleeping well for the last few days because I think I was really, I didn't realize what a psychic toll that the request of reading from my own narrative would take. And that brings me to the title of my portion of this presentation, which is Care and Contagion. And I'm thinking about what we can do to make care and self-care a contagious and normalized part of everyday life and academic survival. And the reason I asked you to imagine the unimaginable at the beginning is because I think care is in part about imagining possibilities beyond what the world has prescribed for you, or so you and other people believe. Meaning that it's very difficult for me, it would have been very difficult for me to imagine when I was an undergraduate that I would be speaking to undergraduates and then going against what I had been asked to do and what I had been planning to do for weeks, which is simply to read a portion of this book. But sometimes your psyche awakens to new possibilities, and as easy as it would be, or it would seem to be, to read simply from something that I had written and I'm very familiar with, simply reading, words on a page, I underestimated the amount of emotional toll that might have entailed. And I want to talk also about how this relates to trauma, because so if you've read portions of the book, what I experienced was quite traumatic, and it was traumatic and sustained because it was a chronic pain condition that unwound a lot of my sense of identity, of place in the world. But one thing I'm realizing is that trauma isn't just something that happens to you that then affects you down the line in ways that you don't anticipate, although that is a common clinical and metaphysical way of defining trauma. I'm realizing that inherent in trauma is an element of very private gaslighting, that trauma always comes with plausible deniability in terms of its post-traumatic effects, such that when you feel years down the line that you are still reeling from an originary trauma, that trauma itself is insidious because it carries with it the power of plausible deniability, such that you can always doubt yourself as to whether you have a legitimate reason to experience what you're experiencing as a result of that trauma. You're constantly doubting whether you're simply too weak of a person, too vulnerable, and whether this might have nothing to do with the trauma that you experienced 5 or 10 years ago. And that's what's so powerful about trauma, is that it makes you doubt the fact that there was ever trauma to begin with, and that perhaps that trauma was just a blip on the radar. So the consequences of trauma are constantly gaslighting the sufferer. And even these last few days, as I was preparing to simply, again, read from a book, I kept doubting whether I was really dreading that reading, that act of reading, or whether I just wasn't sleeping well because, I ate too much Chinese food a few days ago, and I didn't get enough exercise on a certain day. I kept doubting that was what was causing me lack of sleep and anxiety, because that's what trauma does. Trauma tells you that you're simply not taking care of yourself enough in the right ways, and it tells you that it's not at fault. So with that in mind, and with all this said, I realized that the value of being in making the best out of these remote formats is indeed the interaction portion. So I'm happy to cede the remainder of my time either to other panelists or to addressing any questions that have percolated in the minds of our attendees. Mimi, are people able to pose questions by chat? It seems like the raise hand function is available. Okay. Yeah, I welcome any thoughts, but I hope none of you are too disappointed that I'm not reading from the book, but it's almost as if that narrative is, I have tucked it behind like a little brick wall in my mind, because I can't let it come through too much. Otherwise, it will be an unpleasant experience for me, not just in the moment, but also going forward. And of course, this applies to the principle of not asking people to repeat and relive and re-embody trauma is perhaps most pronounced in legal and judicial proceedings, wherein, say, victims of sexual assault are often asked unjustly to relive, retell, and relitigate their own trauma. Why do we think that that is the only way to find justice? And how do we account for self-care when we are asking victims and sufferers to recapitulate and to psychically relive and revocalize what they have suffered?
Thank you very much.
Thanks.
Dr. Cheng. So one function of Zoom is what we're going to use for asking questions. But I would like us to give Professor Paul Quadros a chance to present his material before we start the Q&A. So Professor Quadros, please.
Well, thank you very much, Dr. Una, and thank you to all the participants for coming, Dr. Chen, Dr. Levina. Dr. Levina, afterwards, I'd like to talk with you about these movies like Omega Man, if you remember that old movie with Charlton Heston, and what's the other one? Outbreak with Dustin Hoffman. Those are movies that have been in my mind since the pandemic started. I was asked to sort of give my assessment or what's happening now in my community here in North Carolina, specifically among the Latinx community with regard to the pandemic. And so that's what I'm going to do. But I want to give you some background and then also want to show in real time what's sort of happening. And this of course, ties in with Dr. Levina's acute observations about pandemic and how groups are made to be outsiders of a pandemic and then are blamed for that. So I'm going to see if I can share my screen here. Can I do that? Can someone give me that ability to share my screen? Let's see if I can do that. Nope. Let's see if I can do that.
Benita, do I have control over that?
Do you have the green button?
Yes, I do have the green button.
Does Professor Quadros?
Yes, I have the green button. I think you have to make me a co-host.
But it's not, since I'm not the host right now, I think you would have the ability to share screen.
Okay.
Okay.
Damn, how's that?
Great.
Can you see that?
Yeah, that looks good.
All right. Technology. Okay, so I put this together rather quickly, and I simply looked at data and information that's being released from our Department of Health and Human Services here in North Carolina. But I think I can speak to many things that are happening in other states, especially in the South and in the Midwest, where we've seen the migration of people from south of the border, from Mexico and Central America, into the interior of the United States over the past 25, 30 years now, and how our communities here have changed and how that change has sort of affected other communities here in the American South. This is a first slide that kind of links up with what Dr. Levina was saying in terms of pandemic and how government agencies and political leaders can use a pandemic for their own purposes. And this, of course, is Governor Ron DeSantis from Florida. Right when Florida was beginning to peak in June, he released a statement in which he said that the spiking numbers of COVID-19 could be blamed or could be seen or were as a result of the Hispanic community and mostly farm workers in Florida. to sort of explain away the spike that was happening in Florida. Of course, now we know right in the middle of when they are not necessarily peaking, but when they are surging right now, that this sort of line that he used has since fallen away. And then this was yesterday here in North Carolina, where our senator, one of our incumbent senators, Tom Tillis, who's running for election in November, had this to say yesterday with regard to the pandemic and Latinos, in which he said that the Latinx community here were less likely to wear masks, even though there had been evidence and data from the CDC in a survey that they had conducted as to who is wearing masks and who is not wearing masks, who were more likely to wear masks and who were less likely to wear masks. And that data showed that the Latinx population was more likely to wear masks than the white population that was surveyed by the CDC. This also tied in with the Pew Research Center's information and surveys as well. The media, of course, picked up on this story immediately here in North Carolina, and it may be spreading out from there. At this point, Tillis has not followed up any remarks after saying this yesterday, but you can see that both the what we would consider a mainstream media here in North Carolina, our Latinx media, which I have a slide here of Enlace NC, which has been reporting, has been doing such a great job here in North Carolina on the pandemic and the community. And then other non-traditional media as well also picked up on this story. And pretty much all the media has had one take on this story here in North Carolina with regard to Tillis's statement about the Latinx community and the use of masks. So this is a story that's breaking literally today as we speak, and it kind of shows you how government officials, politicians, of course, has politicized the pandemic for their own uses and for their own politics. Just to provide some data on my state, on North Carolina and the Latinx community, the community has grown to about 10% of the population here in North Carolina. And this is a state that's seen a growth from very, very low percentages in 1990 to now being 10% of the state population. In some communities in North Carolina, and the community that I do my writing in and my research in Chatham County and in Siler City, that's a community in which the Latinx community has expanded greatly in the past 30 years. And Siler City today is a majority Latinx community. And that is not the only town or city in North Carolina that is majority Latinx. There are a few others that are as well Latinx majority. This is just to give us a basis on some of the numbers I'm going to throw at you with regard to COVID from the health department. These are our confirmed cases that the health department has been able to confirm on positive cases. The total cases have been around 91,000 people who have tested positive for the cases. But if we look at the charts that the health department has provided, we can see, where communities are being affected. And one of the stories that has gotten less attention than the overall numbers is when we look at the bottom here and we break down cases by ethnicity, and we can see that Hispanic is the term that's used here by the health department, but we can see the Latinx community here being represented among positive cases at 44%. This was actually 46% a few weeks ago, but it has since come down a little bit at 44%. And this is a percentage that has not gotten as much attention as other groups have gotten, but it represents a significant view of where our cases are coming from and who is mostly being affected by COVID-19 in North Carolina. And I haven't had a chance, of course, to look at other contiguous states in the South, Georgia, Arkansas, Alabama, and they are connected. They're connected by industry and by migration that's happened in the past 30 years. And then when we look by age, of course, we're seeing a spike here in our 25 to 49-year-old population. And there's been a lot of media attention with regard to young people becoming infected with COVID. but I suspect that this is also representative of the Hispanic or Latinx population. Our Latinx population here in North Carolina is a young population. The median age of Latino people here in North Carolina is 26 years old. And that's actually true for the rest of the country as well. The Latino community in the United States is a relatively young community. And so these numbers might be reflected within that community. But this is kind of what I wanted to put people's attention on, is that 44% of positive cases in North Carolina are coming from the Latinx community. And then we can divide this also by looking at some of our major metro areas in North Carolina, and we can see significant percentages for Hispanics or Latinx people in North Carolina. In Durham County, we're looking at 66% of positive cases are identified as Hispanic or Latinx. And in Mecklenburg County, where the city of Charlotte is located, this is at 57%. And then in Wake County, where the city of Raleigh is, we're represented at 46% of positive cases for COVID-19. And this is something that, you know, we have a lot of Hispanic people or Latinx people within our major metro areas or these counties. But when we look at rural counties in North Carolina, we have significant population size within the rural counties, but less numbers, but significant populations within these rural counties. Chatham County is the county that I sort of focus on. And the Latino community here in Chatham is at about 50% of the entire population, a little bit larger in Lee County and in Duplin County in the 20 percentile range for Latinx people within that county. When we look at the breakdown of COVID positive cases in these counties, we can see that Chatham is coming in at 61%. Lee County, which is just south of Chatham County, is at 67% of Hispanic people being tested positive for COVID. And Duplin County, which is home to the largest hog processing facility in the world at Smithfield in Tar Heel, North Carolina, has a positive rate for Latinos at 62%. And this is something that I think hasn't gotten a lot of media attention with regard to positive cases in North Carolina, but also in the rural South as well, is that when we see the agricultural industry and other industries in which Latinx people are in, we see large numbers of positive cases of COVID-19. When we look at the media's attention on COVID, this is something that we don't see at all that has the amount of attention and focus that this kind of story probably needs to have for intervention. The media narrative also here in North Carolina is that the infection within the Latinx community is mostly around the agricultural industry or the poultry or food processing industry. This was true in South Dakota too. This has been true in Arkansas with Tyson Foods. The food processing industry is an industry that attracted and continues to attract of Latinx people from south of the border to work in the industry, and has attracted a lot of workers to come into these rural counties and to work. However, this is not necessarily true for the metropolitan areas. And I suspect, and this is just at this point, just reportage and not necessarily investigation, but that the construction industry is a significant industry for the Latinx people in terms of the spread of COVID-19, and not just the food processing industry or the poultry processing industry or the agricultural industry. That we've seen a good number of attention in terms of media stories focusing on the food processing industry. What we haven't seen is the real focus on the construction industry here in North Carolina in the South among Latinx workers and the spread of COVID. And that also includes for the metro areas, the service industry, the restaurant industry, other industries in which many Latinx workers serve in and are contracting COVID because they are working in these close quartered environments. One thing to keep in mind is that all three of these industries are essential worker industries. And this explains, we think, I mean, that's something that has to be investigated, but this is one of the reasons why we think that these numbers are so high within the Latinx community in a state like North Carolina is that these workers are all considered essential workers, and they've never really stopped working. Since the start of the pandemic in March, the Latinx community has never stopped working because of their numbers within these three industries. The food processing industry, of course, was declared by the Trump administration to be an essential industry and had to remain working. And then in terms of anything involving with food, the Latinx community has a tremendous amount of workers in the service sector for that industry, and then in the construction industry. So one of the things that we see even on the campus of UNC, the construction, and you know, all our universities always have construction in them, is that those workers never stopped working during the early stages of the pandemic when everything shut down. This community continued to work, and it explains why these numbers are so large within the Latinx community. This is Siler City, North Carolina, which is at about maybe 50% or more Latinx or Hispanic in terms of its total population, and is a majority Latino community at this point. It's home to one of the largest poultry processing operations in the state. And just to give you a little bit of background on what's been happening in a town like Siler City with a poultry processing plant, a food processing plant, is that the company began early on in the pandemic to test its workers and then to report those results. But once those numbers started going up, the company stopped releasing those figures to the general public. And now we don't know how many workers are being tested positive within that particular plant. The plant, of course, cannot shut down because of the edict from the Trump administration, so it continues to work. One of the things that we discovered in terms of reporting by the media is that there is a distinction in these companies between those workers who work directly for the company and those who are contract workers with another company but work within that plant. And this is true for the food processing industry all over the United States. You have one company, in this case, it's the Mount Air Poultry Processing Company, Mount Air Farms. They have their set of employees, but then they contract with a separate subcontractor for other workers to come into their plant and then to cut chicken and prepare chicken for distribution to mass consumption. And that distinction is important because the company will release data on its own workers, but not on the subcontractors. So the contract workers, because they are a separate company, the poultry processing company is able to make this sort of distinction with regard to its numbers and the subcontractors' numbers. In addition, that also applies to the benefits for workers in a poultry processing plant. So the company's workers may have health insurance, they may be provided 2 weeks time off with pay if they are sick. The subcontracting workers do not get those same benefits. And this is reported by workers within the plant and at other plants in North Carolina. The subcontractors do not have the same benefits as the regular employees of the company. And that's a huge, huge point to make because those workers then cannot stay home and recover if they're sick without the fear of losing their job. So that's a real distinction in terms of these types of workers. It's been reported, at least at the plant in Siler City, that 80% of the workers are contract workers. So that's a significant portion of the labor force within these companies that are not necessarily employees of the company itself, but rather other employees that they can not pay attention to or not provide benefits for. And of course, many workers feel that they're unable to socially distance at the plant or on the job, on the construction site. And so that makes it difficult for them to socially distance at home. And many of these workers and their families live in substandard housing, and that also makes social distancing much more difficult. The workers themselves, when they're contractors, this is true for the agricultural industry, but it's also true for the construction industry. So you may have a construction work site in which the contractor has its crew out there and then subcontracts with another crew to provide the actual workers on the job. And then again, there's this two-tier system or maybe even three-tier system, depending on the number of subcontractors on a construction job site. Latinx workers are overrepresented in these industries. And this allows the companies to avoid scrutiny by the media, by regulatory agencies, or even by the health department. And this is an important thing to be able to understand with what's happening in the pandemic among the Latinx community here in North Carolina. As we said earlier, COVID is exposing lots of things in our society, and all the sort of vulnerable points in our society are being exposed. It's obvious that the Latinx community never stopped working during the pandemic, and that this community is being disproportionately impacted by the virus in North Carolina and in other southern states. And then, of course, access to healthcare has always been an issue in this community. And for those workers who are contract workers, they may not have access at all to any health care. Crowding and substandard housing is an issue in the community. And the media lacks information about bringing these stories to the fore and putting attention on them. Working in jobs are an impediment to good health and sheltering, social distancing, and being protected from the virus. I think that's a looming story for the Latinx community. And in education, because many Latinx people live in rural areas, access to remote learning is affected, and many of our county school districts are now choosing to go remote. That's something that's happening this week, as well as our metro areas are choosing to teach remote in the coming fall. And this is going to impact this community especially. There's something very interesting about positive cases and deaths when you look at the data. And that is that even though you have this disproportionate impact on the Latino community here in the South with positive cases of COVID in the Latino community, one of the things that we're not seeing is an equal disproportionate impact with regard to deaths. So you can see here in the lower left corner, when it comes to deaths, Hispanics or Latinos have a 10% rate here. And that's true for rural counties as well. I only gave one example of Chatham County at 6%. And I think this is because of the relative young population, median age of 26 years old. And so while we see large numbers of positive cases, we're not seeing equally large numbers of deaths with regard to COVID, at least not yet. You know, of course, there's a lag time for this, but at least we're not seeing that now. And some closing thoughts that we can all discuss in our discussion section, which is that there needs to be more focus from health officials on the Latinx community. There needs to be more focus from the media on this community and COVID. And the issue of subcontracting workers also has to be focused on as a means by which the virus is spread within this community. And a better understanding of how labor and health interact together with regard to this community also needs greater focus. And then access to healthcare, and of course, access to the internet for rural communities. And some other observations, of course, the Latinx media here in North Carolina is small, but it has actually been doing a great job. Enlace Latino NC has been all over this story, as well as non-traditional media. Those two aspects of the media have been on this story better than the mainstream media has here in North Carolina. And of course, I talked about deaths, and more data needs to be collected with regard to health outcomes for this community. And finally, you know, in the past 20, 25 years, the population growth in the United States has been derived mostly from this particular community. And so the final question remains, you know, how will the pandemic impact this particular community that has been driving growth in the United States over the past 20 to 30 years? I'm going to close out there, and then we can have a discussion on all the stuff that we talked about.
All right. Thank you very much, Professor Quadros. So obviously, these are all very, very interesting presentations that we've heard, and it's a good follow-up to yesterday. where there was a concentration, where there was an emphasis on issues of race and racism in light of George Floyd, and discussion about police brutality in Brazil, and also a discussion about issues of vulnerability, resiliency, and genocide. And so for today's panel, we are very, very fortunate to have listened to these three presentations on how we can construct pandemics are constructed and how we can understand them. And so that was the presentation given to us by Dr. Lavina, and Dr. Chen discussed his book and the issue of imagining, and how the issue of care is very important. Care about imagining possibilities beyond what the world has planned for you. And so now for Professor Quadros, we have just listened to him talk about the COVID-19 and the impact it's having on the Latinx community. And, you know, I would like us to begin the Q&A by just asking you, anyone that wants to ask a question, to use the raise hand function of Zoom. And I'm looking through and I don't see any raised hand right now. So Benita, I have a question for you.
I see a couple of raised hands in
there are
the
a few quick
attendees
raised
panel.
hands. Dr. Lacerna has his hand raised, so I'm gonna go ahead and allow him to ask.
Okay, I see it now. I didn't click the correct button. All right, so yeah, Dr. Lacerna has a question, and then Jaylene Taylor has a question. So we begin with Dr. Lacerna. Dr. Lacerna, you probably are muted.
All right, I think I've been given access now. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Great. I just want to, first of all, thank Professor Una, but also all of our panelists. So this was an incredibly enlightening panel. I think that it's very timely, and the information that you all gave us was so practical for us to be able to use right here and now. So I just think that this is really a remarkable panel, and I want to thank each one of you. Professor Quadros, it's good to see you virtually. I have a question for you, and I just really thought that the information that you provided was incredibly useful, particularly for you know, Latinx people here in the community. And I wanted to ask you, just what do you think that, I guess, scholars, professors, students can do to raise awareness about some of the issues that you brought up, to kind of to try to work with and help and advocate for the Latinx community here in North Carolina, particularly? What can advocates, allies, and other Latinx folks here in the academy do to try to like you said, talked about the media needs to pick this up more, but what can we, what's our role in helping ensure that that happens?
I think one of the things that scholars can really do is to begin to collect data. And I mean, this is all happening in real time. So this falls more into like reportage at this moment, but to collect data now and to keep tracking what's happening with regard to these trends. And also, I think that a lot of the emphasis has been placed on agriculture. Naturally, I mean, it's one of our largest industries here in North Carolina in the South, but nobody's really looking and examining at the construction industry as a mover, not only just for migration, because it has been over the past 20, 30 years. The development of the American South, from expanding roads to buildings and schools and communities, is one of the big factors as to why the Latino community has grown so much here in the American South. But now, how does that also apply to COVID? Workers are being exposed on the job site. They're outside, so there's some protection there, but it's really when they are traveling to the job site that they come into a greater exposure. So because they have to travel together on trucks, sometimes construction crews can be maybe 5, 6 workers in a van and a truck and some other transportation. And so they're in close contact with each other, driving to the job site and then working there. And while they may be outside, masked outside, it's really, I think, the to and from to the work site that they might be coming in contact with the virus. So that needs to have more attention on it. I think that for scholars, scholars want to examine communities and want to find out what's happening. And but I think for scholars that are interested in the Latinx community, we need to be able to research in areas where the community works in. Work is such a big component of our community. It is it's a big part of the identity of the Latinx community, and certainly of workers. And so we need to focus our attention in terms of our research where our community is working. Yes, agriculture, and there's a lot of research that's been done on that, but also on construction as well.
Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Lassana, and for your question, and Professor Quadros, thank you for that response. We have a question from Jaylene Taylor, who is one of the MURAP students. Jaylene, go ahead.
Okay, can everyone hear me?
Yes.
Okay, thank you all for your presentations. I definitely learned a lot today. Dr. Chang, especially thankful to you for your unexpected and very candid expression of what your presentations would be today. I found it very timely. And so my question for you is, how has, I guess, like in the midst of a pandemic and like trying to exercise like these notions of self-care, especially when like self-care has become sort of like this buzzword almost in like mainstream media, like how does the contagious effect of self-care you talked about, like how is that like either enforced by its trending popularity as opposed to like what it actually looks like in like real practicality? So if you could speak a little bit to that, thank you.
Sure, thanks so much for your question. You're absolutely right that as larger populations begin to catch on to and grapple with notions of self-care, that the sheer popularity of the concept and the practice always runs the risk of making that concept vulnerable to, say, mockery or parody or overuse. It's easy to dismiss something when it seems to be suddenly trending because people view popular practice with suspicion. At least that's the typical kind of psychic and social tendency. But what I will say in response to the important points you raised is that there are people, including myself and perhaps many of you as well, who have never seen self-care as something that's optional. When you go through trauma, when you experience microaggressions and aggressions, when you are embroiled in the aftermath of systemic racism or poverty or just general precarity, it's not really a choice that you make whether or not to take care of yourself for survival. It's just something that you do without even feeling the need to articulate or theorize it as self-care. So if anyone is skeptical of the value of self-care or of the sustained importance of self-care, that might mean that they've never needed to exercise the kinds of self-care that don't come as an option to people whose very survival has depended on that. So to even doubt the value of self-care already betrays a kind of individual privilege in that regard. And yeah, I mean, it seems like as this conversation permeates our lexicon and our cultural consciousness, you know, people constantly saying these days to take it easy on yourself in the midst of the pandemic, and to here are 5 ways to start your day. You know, all these very BuzzFeedy type of listicles and articles. A lot of them neglect the fact that these aren't really, it's not a fad, and it's not a trend. It's a deathly serious issue, this notion of caring for oneself and caring for one's community. For people to think that this is something new and that suddenly we need to choose ourselves, to use the words of that came up yesterday, already suggests an ignorance of historical context and of the sheer diversity of precarious situations that confront many of the most vulnerable populations. So thank you for your question.
Excellent. Thank you, Dr. Chang. I have a question from Ariel Coleman on the chat, and I'm just going to read the question. So she's got a question for all 3 presenters today. So first for Dr. Levina, she says, Dr. Levina, can you speak more to the role of capitalism on the health industry? And for Dr. Chen, what do you think would be a better way for the legal system to handle sexual assault cases? And then for Professor Quadros, how has the Trump presidency affected the public policy surrounding health and the Latinx community? So I guess we begin with Dr. Levina.
Yeah, sure. Thank you so much. This is a great question. I mean, I am obviously not an expert in healthcare industry, so, you know, from limited stuff, my limited perspective, I guess what I was trying to refer to in this presentation is the general expectation of sacrifice that sort of have always been implicit in, you know, in the functioning of capitalism, right? Capitalism is at its core, as an economic system, is the idea that the many sacrifice for the benefit of the few. I mean, that's just a foundational system of capitalism. And all of these messages, what I find really hard, at least for myself, is that all of these sort of implicit messages just being made so explicit, right? That there is, that, you know, and Professor Quadros, I think your point about, you know, Trump administration labeling eating meat as an essential activity right now, enough to sacrifice. And I love meat. I am a Russian. I am an omnivore. I love meat. I am not coming from this from a vegan perspective whatsoever, or vegetarian even. Love meat. Having said that, it's not just the eating of meat, it's the eating of particular type of meat that's available at a particular type of price, right? And distributed in a particular type of way that somehow supersedes the needs of a community to stay safe. And these assumptions, we've been making them for such a long time. And I can't even talk, like, I can talk about like being exhausted myself, but, you know, I'm in a privileged position. I'm a tenured professor at the university. You know, my work, while completely dispiriting at times, is no match to the work that the workers are doing in these plants to not just assure meat eating, but to assure the mass consumption of cheap meat that is so divorced also from the bodies of the animals that you can't even tell what that meat is when you buy it in the grocery stores. They have to actually literally label it. You know, like, this is chicken, this white meat is chicken, this white meat is pork, right? It's so divorced from the animal. So everything becomes sort of so much divorced from the bodies that are actually sacrificed at the production of the system. And one of the most dispiriting, but also one of the more intellectually interesting things about COVID is the way it laid bare this idea that we as a society, we fall apart the moment some people cannot be sacrificed anymore. So we have to insist that they're sacrificed in order for our society to function. You know, we have to actually literally render certain types of, like large swaths of populations as being disposable, right? In order to continue our way of life, which is not sustainable then. And we all know it's not sustainable, but God damn it, if we're not gonna kill a bunch of people trying to prove that it is, you know? And so to me, those are issues about capitalism as a system and health and the ways that the bodies are being processed and used in those ways, just all deeply interconnect together.
Thank you very much, Dr. Levina. Professor Quadros?
The Trump administration. So one of the things that one of the first things they did was to label food processing as essential. And you know what Dr. Levina is saying is spot on. They did so because one of the campaign's largest contributors in 2016 was the owner of Mount Air Farms, poultry processing, which is the plant that I'm talking about in Siler City. He gave the Trump administration, the Trump campaign rather, millions of dollars, and was one of the early backers of Trump when no one thought that Trump could actually win the election. And so Trump rewarded him and the rest of the industry by declaring food processing an essential industry, and thereby locking in workers, trapping them essentially into these plants. They couldn't leave these plants. They couldn't leave to be sick without fear of being fired or losing their jobs. And they don't make a lot of money in these plants to begin with, but the money that they make helps them to feed and support their families. And so many of the workers felt trapped, that they had to be on the job site. They couldn't shut these plants down. And this was all in effect to keep them up and running, and to ensure that the meat supply or the animal protein supply would continue in the United States. You know, in terms of sacrifice, Dr. Levina, I'll add in how teachers feel in our public schools. They feel like they are being sacrificed to the economy for teaching in an open classroom environment. And they're the ones who are going to sacrifice their health, their bodies, maybe their lives, so that the economy can get back up and rolling again.
Yeah. I mean, yeah, I mean, we all, I think a whole lot of people are feeling this way, right? And not just feeling. I feel like prefacing it by saying like we feel trapped or we feel like we're being sacrificed, it somehow divorces this a little bit. No, we are trapped. The workers are actually literally trapped. It's not a feeling of anything, right? It's the actual reality of lives. Teachers are literally being forced to choose between education and other things. That's a whole different thing. But we are not willing. We're willing to sacrifice so much and at the same time so little. And these juxtapositions between like what's sacrificable and what's not is really, like these slippages I find really stunning right now.
I think
Interesting.
I think that's because of the politics behind the pandemic. It has skewed and distorted how a healthcare crisis can be managed.
And of course, you know, we also have to think of this in the context of the ongoing presidential election, and that really it's an important part of the conversation as well in terms of, you know, the kinds of policy decisions that are taking place at the federal level. Right? So policies that are taking place for the benefit of one single individual. So we have another question from one of the MURAP students. Tyler has a question. Tyler, can you go ahead with your question, please? Tyler, can you hear me? Tyler is probably muted. Hello?
Can Benita unmute Tyler directly? I don't seem to have that capability. Oh, okay.
Hello.
Oh, okay.
Can
Sorry
you hear
about
me?
that. Yeah, now we can hear you, Tyler. Go
Sorry,
ahead.
I was trying to talk, but like some reason it was hard for me to unmute. My question is for Dr. Chang, who I really enjoyed what you said, and I was particularly curious the way that you just explained self-care in response to Jalen's question, as being something that should not be co-opted, but like is a particular way that people who have suffered traumas seek to distance themselves from that. I'm curious, what is your... Did I get cut out? Okay, I'm so sorry. My service is off right now. But I'm curious to know, what is your understanding of self-care as it relates to people who are who may not have incurred some kind of trauma? And I say that people from very like privileged positions, whether that be from their whiteness, from their maleness, from their heterosexuality. Do you think self-care is the correct term that we want to use to describe that kind of process for those individuals? Not saying that they're not in need of it, but what would be a better terminology to conceive of the ways that those people need to alleviate themselves from the stresses of society in a very different way that's not related to their inherent traumas as people who are manufactured or marginalized in society?
Yeah, thanks for your question, Tyler. I'm not sure that a terminological change is what's needed. I think it goes deeper than that and broader than that. I think it's the way that we perform self-care. And when I say, I paused because I realized that this is ambiguous terminology that I'm using. We conduct self-care for ourselves, but there's also a performance element, I think, to contemporary practices of self-care. And by that, I simply mean that often when someone who is perhaps privileged demonstrates self-care, they don't just do it for themselves. They put it out into social media, such as Twitter or Facebook, and they say, look, I'm at the spa, it's self-care, hashtag COVID-19, or hashtag self-care. Or look, I'm taking the day off and I'm watching Netflix all day. It's great to spread the message that taking care of oneself is extremely important. It's not great if someone feels like that they need to brag about their ability to take time out and go to a spa to people who might not even have that choice. In other words, I don't see much relation between the performativity that comes with the pressure of being on social media and the actual needs that give rise to acts of self-care that may or may not feel voluntary to begin with. So when people talk about self-care, so much of it feels performative to me, because I'm not able to get the sense of whether people who put on these performances understand that for some, such care is not really voluntary, that it's actually a method of bare survival and of moving from one day to the next or moving from 1 hour to the next. And that there's this kind of yawning gap between what we think of as popular notions of self-care and what the most fundamental kind of survivalist function of care actually is.
Thank you very much, Dr. Chang. We have a question on the chat from one of the staff members of MURAP, Mimi Godor. Mimi, can you go ahead with your question? Hello? All right, I do have the question in written form, so I'll go ahead and ask it on her behalf. The question is directed to Dr. Chen, and it is, how much do you see care intervention developing beyond this moment within academic spaces?
Dr. Una, can you repeat that question again? I can't
Yes,
see it in the chat, actually.
Yeah, it's really one of the very first questions asked.
Oh, okay.
The question is, how much do you see care intervention developing beyond this moment within academic spaces?
Yeah, that's a great question, and I don't think I'm qualified to answer it fully because I am not very aware of how widespread care interventions are across institutions and across geographical regions. What I would like to say on that note, though, is that it's even outside of moments of pandemic and emergency, care interventions offered by institutions are oftentimes extremely insufficient and also concurrently masquerade as coverage for that institution's liability in terms of the wellness of its employees and its constituents. What I mean by that is, to put a very kind of concrete note on this, UNC, as with Dartmouth, as with many places, probably has these wellness events, maybe more so than ever. And at these wellness events, you get stress balls, you get little trinkets, perhaps branded with your institution's name on it. And I applaud the people who come up with these initiatives and who encourage people to make use of, a 5-minute free massage or a stress ball or a cup or a mug, hand sanitizers. But these are extremely cheap and oftentimes ultimately unuseful band-aids that masquerade as solutions to systemic problems, and not just problems of mental health, but also of racism and sexism and just prejudice at large. What institutions need to provide are more and more accessible mental health services, as opposed to giving us yellow or green stress balls that we carry around with us and squeeze as if we were automatons that could actually find relief by these very small measures. So whether we're in a pandemic or not, the responses of institutions to the needs and care of their members are sorely always lacking. And oftentimes it's a result of lack of willingness to put money where their mouth is, because it's much more expensive to hire and offset the costs of therapists than it is to buy a box of 1,000 keychains that say Wellness Week at such and such a school. It's really rather embarrassing the way that some schools and institutions and companies handle the care of their employees. And yeah, to go to both of my co-panelists' points, it's in part because maybe institutions think of us as sacrificable, as dispensable, as replaceable, and that if someone breaks so much that they can no longer be an employee at the institution, well, the institution will simply hire someone to replace you. Our care is not really their concern past a certain point. The institution is not there to be our friend or our therapist. It's there to make the most of our labor and to make sure that they capitalize on that labor. And when the body is expended and can no longer carry out that labor, we are easily replaced by someone who then steps in and then becomes yet another disposable source of labor. And I realize that's a bleak view, but in my experience, it's true. Thanks for your question.
Thank you, Dr. Chen. That is just such a fundamental response to that question. And thank you, Mimi, for that excellent question. I would like to take the moderator's prerogative here and ask a question for Dr. Levina. So Dr. Levina, earlier on, during your presentation, you said that the problem of pandemic is a problem of governance and security. And I was wondering if you can expand upon that statement that you made earlier in your presentation. In other words, how is a pandemic a problem of governance, especially? That's what I'm especially interested in hearing you explain for us.
Yeah, of course. There is, yeah, so it's a great question, and obviously I can talk about it at length. I mean, we are sort of living through, I believe, what is a really painful and long example of how pandemic is a problem of governance, right? Because one of the things that always interested me and how I got to pandemics is what is a fundamental question of difference, right? And how do we mark bodies, certain bodies, as different in society? And I use the category of difference as opposed to talking just about race or sexuality or gender or class or disability or age or any of those vast identity categories, because to me, always difference was a quick way of getting to which one of those things are labeled as being the most monstrous at any one particular time. Right, and that shifts, obviously, not always, but it does shift. As I came to this country as a Jewish refugee, and in literally traveling from a place where being Jewish was sort of being monstrous, right? I mean, there was very much these categories identity to coming to a country where being Jewish meant being white. And, these like slippages of an identity when it crosses a border, right? When it even sometimes goes out or inside the house, right? These differences. And to me, those are very much a problem of governance, right? What governance to me is like, how do you organize whatever the bodies that are you're governing or being governed or governing themselves, which is somewhat of an illusion. But anyways, and how do we classify them? How do we organize them? And then what do we do to them? What is it? How do we manage them? And pandemics makes, when I was writing this book in 2015, I thought of pandemics as sort of these very much states of exception, right? That clarify these problems of governance. And I think right now, we can definitely see that. Again, to go back to everything that other panelists have discussed, but this idea, again, of whose bodies are disposable, whose bodies are not disposable. But even, if you talk about teachers, my University of Memphis, is doing some sort of weird hybrid thing in coming back, which means that if I want to not teach in a classroom full time, in any sort of way, I have to apply for an ADA, American Disability Act exception, right? I don't consider myself being disabled, but I do have health conditions that make me more vulnerable to this, right? So just being able to negotiate that part of an identity within an institution and within what are some of the things that are making me more susceptible to the disease according to the institutions that job it is to classify and manage those things. So apparently one of the things that, and I'm going to use this as a sort of a personal example because I think it's indicative of something. So in this particular pandemic, what makes my body more susceptible to disease is not the fact that I survived Chernobyl, is not the fact that I have probably chronic thyroid issues and asthma because of those things, not because of that type of, trauma in a sense, but the fact of my weight, which is unrelated to any of those things. And the way that the governance of those medical vulnerabilities function and the way that the bodies are organized with it is the problem of God. It's a problem literally of how do I identify which vulnerability is acceptable, which one is not acceptable, which vulnerabilities we care about and which we don't. Because I'm at least in a fortunate position where I have a choice in some way to at least perform my medical vulnerability, where so many of quote unquote essential workers do not. And those are, to me, literally the issue of governing, not just the issue of governing by the federal government, but the issue of governance that specifically focus on the ways that bodies are moved in space and controlled, especially when the space is viral and diseased.
Wow.
I hope that answers it.
Absolutely. Thank you very much for that beautiful and detailed answer. I think we have time for just one more question. And Dr. Michael Palm is online to ask the last question of this session. Dr. Palm?
Hi, everyone. Thank you all for a really provocative and inspiring panel. My question was inspired by Dr. Labina's presentation, but I think all three of you could probably speak to it. I'm just wondering, looking ahead to the future and thinking about how media coverage and popular cultural representations that you drew on might impact future, media coverage and popular culture representations of future crises, right? I keep coming back to the phrase, the new normal, which has become, kind of I don't know, it bugs me, right? And I think that we're seeing a lot of that here in the last few months. And I'm wondering if you can speculate, thinking about your next book project in particular, Dr. Labina, about how we might see some of the media coverage and popular culture representations, not just of pandemics, but of crises generally impacted by these past few months. And thank you all for a wonderful panel.
Can I just intervene and say that we have just about 2 minutes left, so please keep your responses very brief. Thank you.
Oh, okay, thank you so much for this question. Very briefly, it will be very interesting. We are now living in a permanent state of exception, and I'm really fascinated by the ways this is going to get negotiated in the future. And also, again, with the popular media narratives, I really look forward to all the zombie movies that are going to be made as soon as the Hollywood can come back. Like, you don't understand. This is like, intellectually speaking, everything is terrible. Intellectually, I'm tickled. Since we have short times, that's all I have.
I think that's a great point to add on to is, for the past, 20 years, a lot of our stories have been dystopian, right? I mean, everybody's writing a book on some dystopian society struggling through that. So, so here we are. We're going to get a lot more of that. Or if we come through this, is that going to be the dominant narrative? How we actually come through a dystopian event? Maybe that's going to be the result of narratives afterwards. And then I would look back at 1918 and how the societies came through that in terms of narrative stories.
Dr. Chen, you have, okay. Well, I think that would bring this session to a close. And I would like to thank Dr. William Cheng, Professor Paul Codros, and Dr. Marina Levina for this truly excellent discussion about so many different issues that require care in the present political moment that we are experiencing right now. And I also would like to thank all the participants that join us in today's session. I would now hand it over to Dr. Nguyen, who I believe will take us to the next section.
Yes. Thank you, Dr. Una, and all the panelists. This was such an amazing session. We are going to take a brief break and come back at 1:15 for our next session on self-care in crisis. We hope that you can join us. Thank you. Bye.
Thank you. Bye.